holding this hearing. Thank our panel for taking the time to be able to be here. I'd actually like to be able to follow up because I think it was a pretty good segue in regards to the ranking member's statement saying that the designation of a monument does not alter the rights of the landholders. Living in Colorado, we've had end holdings on those lands. And Mr. Knox, would you maybe speak to this? I think you'd cited a Solicitor General opinion earlier in regards to once we have a presidential designation not going through the legislative process, not having Congress involved in the process, you do catch up private lands that are then included in a designation. Can you speak to that?
I think your question is twofold. The ONC lands are unique, and they are designated by Congress under the ONC Act of 1937 to be dedicated to permanent timber production. That's one question of the president proclaiming them for another use. The private land holdings I will speak to, we are an owner that have the boundaries. The ownership in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument is checkerboard. Within that is access agreements with the BLM that basically give us opportunities to move and remove our forest products. With the access, the management guidelines for the monument do not run parallel to the management guidelines of industrial forests. So the forests there are going to be subject to long-term restrictions on access and long-term increased threat of wildfire from the neighbors' activities, which will be not, for forest resiliency and forest health. It will be for forest preservation. So it is true that we still have rights to do some of the things we want to do, removing these lands, but within these checkerboard areas, where all four of our boundaries of some of our lands are national monument now, we are going to see limitations on access, and we are going to see conflicts with the use next door. And I say it simply is, we have the Pacific Crest Trail that runs through these properties, and they're going to be walking through one section of monument that risk to catastrophic fire, then the next section will be industrial forest lands. They're just not parallel uses.
So effectively, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and you can comment on this. Would it have been perhaps a more effective way, a more deliberate way to, if we were going to designate an area as a monument, to have gone through the legislative process to be able to explore some of the challenges, some of the access issues, some of the cooperation that you were citing?
Yes, I absolutely believe so. I think, a good forest conservation effort would look at the entire landscape. It would not just simply recognize section lines. The process, we did engage with folks and said, if we really are looking at protections and we're looking at the scientific and the ecological value structure of these landscapes, they need to be inclusive of all the lands, not just necessarily the lands withheld in the ownership. So things like trades, boundary adjustments, et cetera, would have been a good thing to have in a discussion in front of Congress so that we could have made some progress to make some of the decisions more clear and more beneficial to the ecosystem.
Thank you, Mr. Knox. And Ms. Clark, maybe you could speak. We happen to have a common boundary along the Colorado and Utah borders they're going through. Just exclusive even of a designation process that's going in. Let's go back to what I was just visiting with Mr. Knox on. When the president, the executive branch, unilaterally makes a decision, what forethought is going into what some of the needs are going to be needed for enforcement, for the resources that are going to be available to actually address those needs? Is there any forethought that goes in when we have unilateral designation by the president?
I doubt there's forethought. There certainly isn't any provision made for those communities. And they immediately feel a need for increased police presence. In the Grand Staircase, they've done a lot of search and rescue. That's an expensive operation. The communities have people coming and going. Their waste systems are challenged, but there's no additional money. So I think they do put burdens on those communities, and I think they're created without regard to those more practical, mundane situations.
So do you think it'd be useful for Congress to maybe be playing a role if something is to be designated, does have community support, to think those issues out beforehand?
I absolutely think Congress should do this And if Congress is unwilling, that should send a very clear message that this isn't a good idea and we shouldn't embrace it through another means.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you, Mr.